Norelco Cassette 4B, Kuhlman on Japan.
To Japan. Also, Chinese writing was gradually adopted. It was changed to form the symbols, not letters as we know it, but symbols that would conform with the Japanese language that was being spoken. Again, that was a language that got some influence from China, some from all of these people. And in fact, China gave Japan its name about this time. The writing came in, and in China, these islands that were to the east of China, the islands where somewhere the sun rose, were named sort of like Zipon, Z-I-P-E-O-N is the nearest you can come to, Zipon. When Marco Polo was in China, we talked about him, he was the great port of Kuhlman. Marco Polo went back to Italy, told the people about Zipon. Well, being an Italian, he changed it to Giappone. Then when these islands were talked about in Europe, the name Giappone was renamed Japon in French, became Japan in English, and the Japanese themselves used a variation of that called Nippon or Nihon. As of Japan, the first great capital about 700 AD, when it began to be a real sort of unified nation, was in Nara. Now Nara is where we're going to visit the deer and the deer park and see one of the earliest wooden buildings in all of the world, the great pagoda in Nara. And this was the first great capital. About 25 miles away from Nara is Kyoto, which is the city we're going to visit tomorrow. Most of us will be going to these areas tomorrow and the next day. Kyoto came along and was the capital about 100 years later, because as one emperor would die, the descendant would take his place, and usually it was, at that point, it was customary to move the capital from one city to another. So the capital was moved over to Kyoto, and there's where the great buildings and the great shrines and great classical Japan grew for about 400 years. And if you have one spot anywhere in Japan to visit for your first time, you must visit Kyoto. And I'm glad we're going that way, because as we go through this land, you can see the development of Kyoto, and then Japan followed it. This was called the Great Heian period, or the Heian emperors, the time of peace, the time of art, the time of great music, not to our ears, but to the Japanese ears. The luxurious living began at this time. The nobles became very elegant. They became very wealthy. They were imitative of the great wealthy people in China and tried to live their way of life. As they became more wealthy, as they became more prosperous, they became more indolent and stopped worrying so much about ruling the people. They were more interested in the taxes that would support this way of life that they had developed. So over in an area near Tokyo, the group of warriors grew up called the shogun, and you will hear a lot about them. Shogun, S-H-O-G-U-N, just means a warrior. This became the military class of people. And before the emperors knew what was happening to them, because for about 400 years they were sitting down in Kyoto smelling cherry blossoms and smelling incense. Well, while they were sitting down there smelling, the great warriors were developing this warrior class, sort of a feudal system up in the area around Tokyo. So the first great shogun was called Minamoto, and finally, before the emperor knew what happened to him, all the power had been taken away from the emperor, and the emperor just became a figurehead. Then you have down in Kyoto, the luxurious nobles living. The shoguns didn't dare do anything to the emperor personally, because he was really a descendant of God. He was a superhuman being. He was actually descended from the sun gods. By the same token, the emperor was not particularly interested in the ruling welfare of his people. He was more interested in just sitting and living and having a wonderful time. So you sort of have what like you had in Greece during its early development. There you had Sparta, where the warriors were living. You had Athens, where the classical, cultural people were living. And in the warrior class developed this great idea of the people who were under the shoguns, that personal life meant nothing. This is very important in what developed in World War II later, but you can see how the trend came. Personal life meant nothing at all. Your one idea of being on this earth was to be dutiful to the shogun, to give up your life for the shogun if necessary. Your money went to the shogun. You practically had no money. You had no land, very little in this feudal system. So everything was based on this idea of absolute blind obedience to the great shogunate powers over in the area near Tokyo. In fact, when you're going around Japan now, you may see kites, or they look like kites. They're balloons on the end of poles with the big fish on them, the carp. This comes from the tradition, and these are all out on Boys' Day. If you're ever in Japan on Boys' Day, every house with a young boy will have a carp floating in the breeze as the wind goes through this paper carp and blows it all up. Well, the carp is supposed to be a very, very brave fish. Another fish, when you catch it and put it down on the block to clean it and cut off its head and get it ready to eat, will wiggle and be frightened. A carp traditionally will lie very still, very frozen, and will face death unafraid. So all of this time, these boys have been getting this training of your one duty is to your country, your one duty is to your shogun. In fact, Japan has been an invincible country till World War II. All its history, it has only been invaded one time, then unsuccessfully by the great Kublai Khan, the great Mongol emperor, who about 1200, about that time, put together a great armada of several thousand ships, thousands of soldiers, and came over to Japan to try to conquer this land. As the ships were crossing the bay, sort of like the Spanish Armada, these thousands of ships were coming across the inland sea, a tremendous typhoon came up. As you know, there are typhoons in Japan. It completely destroyed the Armada, destroyed the invasion, and Japan, up until World War II, had never been invaded. Well, as I mentioned much earlier, the word for divine is kama, and the word for wind is kazi. You put it together, you have your kamikaze. Remember in World War II, the men in the planes who would die and kill themselves in the plane. They knew they were going to blow up the planes in an effort to blow up our ships. Their name, kamikaze, comes from this divine wind, the invincible wind that Japan knew it could never be defeated. It had an invincible army. It had a ruler who was descended from the gods. Well, go along very, very rapidly. The great shoguns lived in the area around Tokyo. They then suddenly discovered that the Europeans were coming in. About 1600, again, our old story, the Portuguese came, then the Spanish came, then the Dutch came, but with the Portuguese, the missionaries started to arrive. The missionaries began to preach the Christian religion as opposed to the religion of the Shinto or the Buddhists, and the shoguns could see that this religion was undermining their great power, because the Westerners were preaching your first duty is to God. Your first duty is not to the shogun, it is not to the country, and it is not to the emperor, who is not really God at all. So about, I'd say about 1600, 1650, there were over almost 500,000 Christians in Japan, and the shoguns completely closed the door to the Western world. You all remember reading your history books about the closing of Japan. It was closed off. The foreigners were thrown out. The Christians were horribly persecuted. Most of them were killed or were deported or were forced to change their religion. And for over 215 years, Japan lived completely isolated from the rest of the world. While Japan was here very quietly, living its own life, the shoguns ruling, the emperor a figurehead, the Industrial Revolution took place. Well, first before that, the Italian Renaissance happened to Western Europe. Japan completely missed that. The Industrial Revolution occurred. Japan completely missed that. And by the time the Western world had been through these two great changes, Japan was still living in complete isolation. Well, they had a great shock then about 1850 when our own Admiral Perry appeared in the bay with his warships and demanded that Japan open its doors to the Western world. On the surface of it, it seems as if it might have been none of our business. Why did we want to go there and demand that Japan open up? But it was partially for trade, but also we wanted to establish diplomatic relations with this land, because as American vessels, as vessels from all over the world would come in these waters, sometimes the ship would be wrecked, the whalers would run ashore. Any of our people that were cast ashore in this land had no hope of ever getting out again. If ships needed supplies or repairs in the area, they didn't dare land because they would immediately probably be killed, as they would never be seen or heard from again. So it was a great effort to open up this land, at least for diplomatic purposes, in case some of our men should get here, some of our ships should have to put in port here, that there would be a council who could negotiate to get them back out into the Western world. All of the countries wanted this. Finally, Japan, after Admiral Perry arrived, he sent a letter to the shogun, and this is where the Western world didn't realize the strange situation that was going on in Japan at the time. By dealing with the shogun, they thought they were dealing with the ruler. Well, the emperor, of course, was not consulted at all. They were given an ultimatum that our warships would be back within a year, and they wanted an answer. President Fillmore had sent this letter saying that we demanded diplomatic relations be established and trade relations be established with Japan. Well, when we came back, the relations were drafted. But it had done a shattering thing to the shoguns in and around Tokyo. They suddenly were undermined. They began to fight among themselves as should they do this, shouldn't they do this. The people saw powers in the outside world. The emperor in Kyoto saw that there was a greater power in the outside world. And the emperor, who by this time was named Meiji, who was one of the great emperors of all time, saw that this was his chance. So as the Americans opened up Japan, the shogun leadership was undermined, it was shattered, it fell apart, and this very fine emperor took over the rule of Japan. And for the first time in about 700 years in Japan, the emperor and the ruling powers were joined as one. So you can see the tremendous upheaval that took place in this land as a result of our doing. Well, then the emperor began to rule Japan, and he moved his capital, and this is the third step, just as we're going in our travels. He moved his capital from the wonderful old city of Kyoto to Tokyo. He renamed the little town of Edo, he renamed it Tokyo. The part of the Japanese word Kyo means capital. See, Kyoto, Kyo begins that word. It was the capital over in the old classic area. Then when he changed to the other era, it was Tokyo, which means eastern capital, and Tokyo began to grow. Well, we mostly know the rest of the history of Japan because we're in the contemporary period. Japan was overcrowded. They tried to get part of China. They declared war on China. We spoke when we were going into Hong Kong that England helped establish good relations with China after the Opium Wars by giving China arms to fight the Japanese. This was part of the result of why the Japanese sided with the Axis later on rather than with the Allies, because England was involved. They declared war on Russia and defeated Russia in Korea. They were still invincible until the World War II came along, and then the great shattering thing happened. Until that time, all the school children had been taught that whenever the emperor's name was mentioned, that he was not a human being, he was far superior, they would stand, they had to learn to recite the many, many emperors, their entire line of history of the emperors. Suddenly, the whole concept of their religion changed. When Japan was defeated, the emperor, with great dignity, but nevertheless, with great humility, was forced to go in front of his people and declare that he was not indeed a god, that he was a human being. You can see what this did to the generation of Japanese that was growing up. Their whole Shinto religion was based on the one idea of their emperor being a descendant of the great line of God in this Shinto religion. That's why, as you get to Japan, I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, you don't see too much in the way of the young people, you sense that they are not an extremely religious race. Now, you see the priests in the temple. If you go, by the way, if you go to a Buddhist temple in Thailand, you can always tell a priest by his saffron robes. Here you will have difficulty doing that because the priests here all wear black robes rather than saffron robes. It's a different sect of the Buddhist religion. We are going then to this strange and paradoxical land of shattered religions, of a change from a medieval world to one of the great industrial worlds in about 150 years, one of the great industrial powers, and we're going to dock at Kobe. Kobe is situated in a very beautiful harbor, Mount Roko in the background. It's about 1,200,000 people. If you are staying in Kobe, there are some lovely shops. The shopping area is called the Motomachi Street, M-O-T-O-M-A-C-H-I, where you'll find many, many shops. And you'll go to the hotel, the International Hotel, where, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, if you're there overnight, there is a very nice show. You can go and have drinks, or you can go and have dinner. It's not too far from the ship, and you can see a very fine Japanese show in the safety of the hotel if you don't feel like venturing out in some of the other nightclubs. Also, the International House there is a great building where there are lots of shops. Some of the councils are there. It's quite an interesting city in which to travel around. But of course, from a purely scenic, tourist, exciting standpoint, you have to go to Kyoto, the ancient capital. We'll be going up there tomorrow. Now, Kyoto is so very important because it was not bombed during World War II. Kyoto and the adjacent city of Nara, now it's all sort of joined into one, and the entire area is now known as Kyoto, was declared by the Allied forces as a world shrine because the great classic buildings of Japan were in Kyoto, and at the instructions of the Allies, our bombers did not bomb this one area of Japan. That's why you will see the magnificent buildings, the great temples, the great shrines, see them as they originally were. Some of them have been restored now in Tokyo, some have been restored in the other cities, but the original ones are still standing in this city. Probably the mecca of where you will travel is the Nijo Castle, N-I-J-O. There you will have to take off your shoes. Be sure to take along your woolly socks in the morning, but do go through the Nijo Castle. It will show you the great Japan. It was built by the shogun, great warrior class. And as you wander through, you've all read about the famous nightingale floors. Well, these are the halls. They're beautifully polished, and as you walk along, they make little squeaky singing sounds like a nightingale. They were purposely done that way with pegs underneath, so that as the shogun was sleeping back on the inside at night, anyone walking up and down the hall, even if you're in padded feet, could be heard by the shogun's guard, because you cannot make a step on these hall boards without having them give out this little singing sound. Also, as you go through the rooms, they look almost like stage settings now, because the Japanese have put life-size figures in the clothes that the great shoguns wore during this medieval time, and they are in the various rooms. You will see the ladies sitting there doing their elaborate headdresses. You will see the shoguns themselves in their great warriors' outfits in some of the rooms. So it's a very interesting castle to walk through, and you really get the feel of the Japanese life of the early Japanese Empire. You go to the Heian Shrine. This city was called the Heian City many years ago, with the great Torii Gate, one of the largest in Japan, over 75 feet tall as you go in. And another temple that is very interesting is the Sanju Sanjendo Temple. You can practice that one as you're going through it. This is the temple of the thousand-handed Buddha, or the thousand-handed Kannon. It's a huge statue of Kannon, the goddess of mercy. She has supposedly 1,000 hands. Now, strangely enough, you see only 42 of them. So there are 42 hands sticking out from this woman, but each hand traditionally will reach out to 25 different places in the entire universe in this transmigration of souls. So if you multiply 25 by 42, theoretically she has 1,000 hands that she is reaching out to help the peoples of the world in this great goddess of mercy. And then the last great sight to see there is the Golden Pavilion. You've seen pictures of it, the beautiful little golden not a pagoda, but it's a Japanese building that is situated on an island in the center of the lake. I do hope it's a sunny day because the reflection with the beautiful pine trees around it give you one of your classic pictures of all of Japan. The building was built about the year 1200. It was then a villa for one of the great rulers. It burned down some years ago it was burned down by a fanatical Buddhist. It was re-erected exactly as it was in the early days and is now a sort of a Buddhist shrine. There's not much to see inside. You don't go over to it itself, but you stand on one side and sort of admire the view. Then near there is Nara. This is another sacred city. There you go to see the largest Buddha in all of Japan. In fact, it's the largest bronze image in the entire world. There are 450 tons of bronze in this image. If you want to compare it, there are about 150 tons of copper in the Statue of Liberty. So you see what a tremendous statue it is. It still is one of the most magnificent and unusual feats of casting in bronze that the world has ever known. It doesn't seem quite as large as the Daibutsu Buddha down near Tokyo, which we'll talk about in just a minute, because this bronze Buddha is inside of a building, and it's the largest wooden building in the world. At least the Japanese say that it is. So you will go in to see the world's largest Buddha, and then you'll go to what is great fun, which is the deer park. The deer park is where about 400 or 500 sacred deer live. It is also the park of the 3,000 stone lanterns, and as you wander around, these beautiful stone lanterns are lining all of the walkways. They're all over the entire area, and you'll be walking along, and suddenly a little deer will appear up from behind one of the lanterns, another one will come the other way, and the school children will all be over feeding the deer. In fact, when you go into the deer park, you'll want to buy some of the little wafers that you can buy especially to feed the deer. In fact, they come up and practically demand to be fed. I put two in my pocket, and before I knew what happened, one of them had his head down in my pocket and was eating the wafers right out. You have to push them away. They're sacred deer because on the back of the first two deer that came to the area, the gods rode. When the gods came to this shrine, they rode on the ancestors of these sacred deer. And of course, it's forbidden to kill the deer. The deer are very fast and very, very tame. In fact, years ago, the Japanese people who lived in the area were very, very afraid of these deer, because if a deer would happen to die at night or something would happen to them, and a dead deer was found on your property, why, you were subject to being beheaded. So, in the early days, if you walked out in the morning and found a dead deer, why, you had to do something with it. Now, this is told by all the guides. If you've heard it before, forgive me, but it's a standard classic crack that the guides will make, so I want to beat it to the punch. So if you found a dead deer on your doorstep, you would immediately pick it up for daylight and drag it over to your next neighbor and put it on his doorstep so he'd be beheaded. And this is where we get our phrase, passing the buck. Pretty often it's a standard Japanese joke, and I thought you would know just in case one of the guys would forget to tell you about it. Well, after we leave this great classic area of Japan, we're going on, a lot of us are going around Mount Fuji. It's a sacred mountain because, as we said, in the Shinto religion, with the worship of things in nature, Mount Fuji was one of the most beautiful things in all of Japan, and naturally it would become an object of sacred worship. So it is called the Sacred Mountain. There will be snow on it this time of year. It will probably be quite cold, and hope when you're around there, you can almost hope that it will be a little cold and crisp, because then you will get a good view of Mount Fuji. Many, many times it's completely surrounded by mist and by haze, and people have gone a day or two in Japan when they're in this area and been very disappointed because they couldn't get a view of Mount Fuji at all. During the summer, Mount Fuji is a great thing to climb. In fact, there's no Japanese saying that if you have never climbed Mount Fuji, you're a fool. If you climbed it more than once, you're an even greater fool, because it takes about 8 hours to climb up to the top and back. But you will get a view of it for you that are staying in the area overnight. They will probably take you to as near a level as you can possibly go, depending upon the snow conditions and the cloud conditions of Mount Fuji at the time. See how much time? Oh, we have 15 more minutes. We have one more area to talk about. But I do want to take 5 minutes if you'd like to hear, because several of you asked me about when you get to a hotel now, should you stay in a Japanese-style room or should you stay in a Japanese inn? I had an experience with it. Would you like to hear in 3 minutes about what happened to me in a Japanese inn? Because it's very interesting, and I'd say don't do it. But we went around to the hot spring area of Kuhlman several years ago, and the Japanese guide had everybody nicely settled in the Western-style hotel, all comfortable, and he said to me, would you like to stay in a Japanese inn? Well, I felt like, who was the gal in happy name? Elizabeth Gooch, I wanted to live, I wanted to see everything, so I said, sure, I put Japanese inn, so off we went. I had to take off my shoes when I got there, and of course the Japanese houses, you see, get their style of architecture from sort of the South Asian Polynesian influence. They're very cool and quite drafty and cool in the summer because they have these tatami mats as flooring, but they're also very drafty and cool in the winter and in the early spring, which this was. So I took off my shoes, and in we went trotting with the Japanese guide doing all the translating back and forth for me. So they got me this Japanese room, and he said, well, now, of course, you'll want to take up Japanese bath tonight. And I felt a little twice at that, and I said, well, yes, I will. He said, well, then you have to have a massage. I'll arrange for it all. Don't worry about it. And he left me. There I was, standing around with nothing in the room, and all of a sudden, a knock on the door, and a little girl came in, and took off my coat, and then started to point to my trousers. So I thought, well, might as well go along with a bit. So off came the trousers, and she pulled out a kimono and put it on me and motioned to sit down. Well, there I was sitting with all the drafts coming up through the floor while she unpacked my bag and laid everything out carefully, chattering away in Japanese all the time. I didn't understand a word, and she'd giggle and look at me, and I'd giggle back, and there we were. Well, finally, a little bit later, while I was sitting there wondering what to do without my pants, I got the point that I was supposed to go take a bath. So then I had to get out of everything else and get the kimono on, and there were two kimonos. One was very heavy and one was very, very pretty. So I somehow put the pretty one on first and then the heavy one, and down I went to the Japanese bath. Well, I got there, and of course, in the more remote areas, the Japanese ladies and gentlemen all take a bath together. This was a huge room, a magnificent bath with trees growing and everything, lots of steam coming up. There were only 2 or 3 people there, so I thought, well, I guess I can get along with this all right. So I had been a little bit briefed by the guide, and I washed very thoroughly. You see, the greatest sin in the world in Japan is to go into the bath unless you've taken a bath before. So you sit in the corner on a little stool. They give you a little washcloth about so big, and you pour hot water and soap all over you, and finally, after you've got all that washcloth, then you walk into the big bath and sort of sit and soak. And the families come in, and everybody's in water up to their heads, and they talk and carry on, and it's very impolite to look at anybody as they're getting in and out of this great bath. It just isn't done. And nothing could be more inoffensive. So finally, though, it was time for me to get out. And by that time, I discovered the pool was quite well filled up with people. I was the only Westerner, and I could see the little glasses because I was in this rather remote inn. I'm sure I was the only one that had been there in quite a long time. Taking more than 3 minutes, but I got to tell you the story now. I'm in the middle of it. So out, and there's gradual steps out. Now, Japanese are built very short and plump. I'm built rather long, particularly from the hips down. Well, as I started to ascend out of this pool, I thought, well, you can't run, you can't destroy the dignity of the West. As my legs came out longer and longer, I could feel every Japanese eye. And there I was, a little washcloth about so big, what you going to do, what do you do with something like that? And I was over in the corner, and to dry, they give you the wet washcloth. You see, now that's another sort of anachronism, that you bring it out and try a little more, and then you bring it out some more. Then I got into the men's dressing room. And I thought, well, now I'm still all wet, so I can't put on this beautiful kimono. So I put the heavy one on first and the pretty one on the outside. Well, finally, the little Japanese man came, well, that was all wrong. You put the pretty one on the inside because that absorbs the water, and then the heavy one on the outside. And finally, I got out of that, back to my room. I thought, well, somehow I'll manage to get some sleep, and knocked on the door, and in came the little girl giving me a massage. Well, before I knew what happened, I thought, well, now this may be like a sauna bath in Finland, where the ladies are sort of like, where they're old and stodgy and like matronly truck drivers is the best way I can describe the Finnish ladies who give you Kuhlman, you know. So this was a very pretty little petite Japanese girl. However, she can't give me much of a massage. She had on sort of a combination of a halter and panties. It was kind of like a combination underwear and swimsuit tennis outfit that she was wearing. Well, before I knew what happened, my kimono dropped. I was flat on the floor on my stomach. She was on the middle of my back, grabbing my leg and pulling it like this so it was hitting my head. Well, I can't do it if I tried a million years. And the louder I yelled, the more she giggled, and the harder she pulled. Well, finally, after, I guess it was about 20 minutes, it seemed like 3 hours of all that nonsense, she went away, and I was going to collapse on the bed. Well, the bed turned out to be two futons, two little cushions, and things over it. So my feet were cold, and I got my feet on the cushion and some little things tucked under, and then I discovered that the pillow came about here, or the futon, and the pillow, which was sort of granite rocks inside of something, was about a foot away to put my head on it. Well, I scooched that up, put my head down on the bed, then it came to about here, and the rest of me was sticking out. And it was cold and drafty. Well, this went on all night long. Finally, the next morning, the guy doing the final favor brought me a Japanese breakfast. The girl did. He had ordered it. So I thought, well, I'll get something to eat after freezing to death and with my head on granite and no. Well, it turned out to be, I opened the first thing, cold seaweed. There was a little girl sitting there very politely, my little hostess, waiting for me to eat it. Well, I took one bite, made an awful face. She thought it was the funniest thing she'd ever seen, and brought on some raw fish, which was the next course for breakfast. Well, to make a long story, it ended up that everybody else the next morning was down at the bus having a wonderful time taking pictures of Mount Fuji. Well, there they were, 3 people in the guide were dragging me out of the Japanese inn and dumped me in the back of the bus, and I didn't recover for a week afterwards, and that's all the rest of the past. But anyway, this is what happens to you when you travel through the hot spring area of Japan, and it was not a made-up story. It really is true, and I've never spent such a miserable night, and I've never gotten more mileage out of a story at home. And everybody looked at me with his leering eye and said, well, what happened to you in the Japanese baths? Believe me, I can tell them. And you don't find that, though, in the big cities. In Tokyo, if you go to the bath, there's now bathing is all segregated. The Western world has come in. And even you that are going to stay at the Fuji Hotel on near the slopes of Mount Fuji, there, it's mixed bathing, but you have to wear a bathing suit. And certainly the fun, at least for going back home and telling the story, has all gone out of it. Well, the rest of us then are going on by ship and land at Yokohama, which is just a big, uninteresting port city. It's about 1.5 million people, and it takes about an hour through incredible traffic and very uninteresting scenery to get to Tokyo, which is now the capital. In fact, it isn't scenery, it's just the two cities have grown together, and the traffic in both of the cities is simply incredible and unbelievable. So if you're coming back to the ship on your own, after you've been up in Tokyo and you leave Japan, be sure to allow yourself enough time, and be sure that when you get in the area, the taxi driver knows exactly where you to go and which ship you're to go, because there have been times when we had a few close calls of people just being unable to communicate. Well, I won't describe Tokyo too much because there really isn't much to describe. It was very much bombed out, World War II, extremely modern now, particularly since the Olympics were here 4 years ago. All the hotels in which you've been staying are all new, have all been built since the Olympics. Magnificent hotels. The big shopping area, and in Tokyo you will want to do some shopping probably, is the Ginza, G-I-N-Z-A, which really means the place of the silver mint. Years ago, this is where one of the early mints for coins and silver was manufactured along the Ginza. Your pearls, as all of you ladies know by this time, there are many now good examples of the not artificial, but of the cultured pearls, but the finest ones are Mikimoto, and you will find his shop along the Ginza and in most of the hotels. There are 2 big department stores. The Takashimaya, many of you who live in and around the New York area know they now have a big branch in Fifth Avenue itself. The Takashimaya store and the Mitsukoshi store is another big one. There will be no problems at both of those stores. can arrange to have English-speaking people with you as you go around shopping. One of them has a big Ferris wheel for children on top. It's sort of a combination of a Walt Disneyland and a supermarket and a great department store and the finest jewelry shops all rolled up in one. Again, I've told you to be careful when you're going out at night, not be careful for any danger, but be sure you have the cars with you so that everybody knows exactly where to take you and so you know how you can get back. The last spot we'll visit is out of Tokyo, still further north, and this is Nikko. The classic city is Kyoto. The beautiful, beautiful spot is Nikko. It's not nearly as large as Kyoto, but here the Japanese have a saying, and you'll hear it time and time again. Never say Kiko until you see Nikko. Well, now, K-E-K-K-O means beautiful. In Japanese, it's the most beautiful thing. And Nikko, of course, is a play on words. Here you go to the great Koshuga Shrine. Facts and figures don't mean a lot to some of us, but I think it will help you sort of vision this in advance if you realize that 2.5 million little squares of gold leaf, about 4 inches, are put on these buildings every 20 years. 2.5 million sheets of this. If it were all put together, it would cover roughly about 6 acres of land, of this gold and the ivory and the white. It's extremely beautiful. It's redone every 20 years, so it's always in very beautiful, light, glittering condition. And again, for this visit, I do hope you have the sun. Notice when you're there the beautiful trees. There are over 40,000 cryptomeria trees. These are the Japanese fir trees. There's a very brief little interesting story about them. When the great shoguns were building this shrine, all of the feudal lords, all of the people in the area were forced to contribute money, forced to contribute gold to build this magnificent shrine here. One of the feudal men was quite poor. He simply didn't have money. So for his contribution, he planted this tremendous acreage of cryptomeria trees. He planted 40,000 of them over a period of 20 years. About 16,000 still standing, and you go along the avenue leading to this shrine, you'll see these splendid trees. And this is used often as a lesson to the Japanese people, the children. It's used as sort of an Aesop fable, not Aesop fable, but it's a moral story that by looking in the future, this man created something with the trees that was even finer than the men who gave the money for the gold, which many times since has been regilded, gold put over and gold put over, while the trees are still standing. There we will see the lovely 5 story pagoda that represent the 5 elements. And as you go up into the area of the shrine, on the sacred stable doors, you will see the most famous panel probably in the world. And this is the 3 monkey panel of see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil. And this is where the little statues that we have had all over the world originally came from. The monkeys were carved there. Also, there's another panel that is very famous and very loved by the Japanese. It's the panel of the sleeping cat. It was carved by one of the finest wood carvers Japan has ever known. And the cat is sleeping there, and ever since the sleeping cat was put up there on the wood panel, there have been no rats or mice in these tremendous wooden temples in the area. So it's a well-loved cat, and the guides will point it out very, very carefully to you. As you come back, you will see the sacred bridge. It's a beautifully shaped bridge, the classic style of the Japanese bridge. It is no longer used, but it originally was one of the entryways to this great shrine. Only the emperor could cross over this bridge and the priests, because years ago, when the priests first came to the stream, tried to get across to go into the temple, he couldn't go. There was a raging torrent, and suddenly out of the sky there were beautiful lights, heavenly music, and 2 sacred snakes or dragons came down, arched themselves across the river, formed this bridge, and it is, use your imagination, sort of the arch of the back of the dragon. And the bridge has not been opened now in many, many years. But all of this forms Nikko, which is the 3rd important tourist area which we will be visiting. Then our last stop on the way back to the ship is the resort of Kamakura, where the great Daibutsu, or the giant Buddha, is located. Daibutsu means Dai is great, Butsu is Buddha. It's the 2nd largest. It isn't as large as the one you will see in Nara, but it gives the appearance of being larger because it's in the open. There used to be a building around it, but about 1498, this building was swept away by a great typhoon, and the Daibutsu has remained ever since. It's the original. The one in Nara, part of it had been broken over a period of years, and part of it was replaced. But this is exactly as it was in the original, and there you see probably one of the most photographed, certainly the most photographed bronze image in all the world, the great Buddha. You've seen pictures of him sitting there with the blissful facial expression and his hand in the position of the reflective calm, and it's one of the great statues and one of the great sights. If you're going to a skiaki dinner along the way, may I suggest the great fun. There you will see the real geishas who will come and entertain for you with their mask-like faces. The geishas are apprenticed to begin their studies now at about the age of 15. They used to be apprenticed when they were 8 or 10. And to be a geisha takes a great deal of training. Gei means art, G-E-I, and sha means person. So this is a person of the arts. They are trained in speaking beautifully, in laughing the correct way, in sitting the correct way, in serving food the correct way, in entertaining the Japanese businessmen. They are not, as often thought, and was certainly thought by our troops in World War II, they are not ladies of the streets. They are not prostitutes by any means. They leave the geisha home when they are paid to come to a very fine house to entertain. They go in twos at a certain hour. They must leave and go back together. Oh, maybe some years later, a geisha may find someone that she really loves, and he may set her up in her own home or a business for when she gets older. But as the general run of accepted thought is concerned, the geisha is far removed from the Western picture that we have. They're taught to train them to play the samisen. You'll see the classic Japanese instrument. It's like a banjo with a very long arm on it. It has 3 strings, because samisen means 3 strings, and they play away from it. As far as I'm concerned, they could have just 1 string or 10 string. It all sounds alike, and they sing interminable Japanese songs, but you still have a feeling of an evening in Japan. And they even now have westernized it a little bit, where everybody sort of gets up and they play a funny little baseball game. It can turn into a most exciting evening, and your skiaki is cooked right by your pillow on which you sit. So ladies wear wide skirts, take along some warm socks, and a good warm coat, and be prepared for a lovely evening with the geisha girls. So in this land, there are 2 words you should know. Arigato, which means thank you, because you'll be saying that over and over again. And the word we all know, sayonara. So sayonara, and I'll see you in the land that fell from the sky tomorrow morning in Japan.